All right, our final lecture for chapter 21, we're going to discuss some of the limitations of the New Deal. Who was left behind in this project? So, a New Deal for women. We do see with this an expanded presence of women in the federal government. The New Deal is going to bring more women into the government than ever before. And the most prominent of these was, of course, the First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt. Eleanor completely transforms the role of First Lady from one with no formal responsibilities whatsoever to a base for political action. She traveled widely. She spoke out on public issues, wrote a regular newspaper column, worked to enlarge the New Deal in areas like civil rights, labor legislation, and work relief. However, at the same time, feminism is experiencing a political decline. Even as women are becoming more visible, organized feminism, in disarray after the 1920s, is disappearing entirely as a political force. And in fact, we even see real resistance to women's employment during the Depression. There are widespread demands for women to remove themselves from the workforce in order to make space for unemployed men to work jobs. But because the Depression often hit industrial jobs harder than clerical or service jobs where women were predominant, the percentage of women in the workforce actually increases in the 1930s. Now, this is not preferable for a lot of government ministers, and so there is a real effort to try and encourage women to leave the workforce. Many married women, for example, were barred from jobs or dismissed. And most New Deal programs did not explicitly exclude women, but the ideal of the male-headed household was powerfully shaping public policy at the time. And so we'll get things like in the second New Deal, Social Security is not going to be extended to domestic workers and things like that. And a lot of women's work is done domestically in that sense. And so women are going to get left out and encouraged to leave. Among other racial minorities in the United States, the Depression and the New Deal had a kind of contradictory impact. The Commissioner of Indian Affairs, John Collier, launched what became known as the Indian New Deal. This was a complete transformation of American Indian policy, and it shifted from the notion of forced assimilation to more of one of cultural autonomy. We see the ending of the policy of forced assimilation and allowing unprecedented cultural autonomy by replacing the boarding schools with schools on reservations, a dramatic increase in spending on health programs, and other things like that on the reservations as well. We also see the passage of the Indian Reorganization Act, which finally reverses the Dawes Act of 1887. The Dawes Act, which required that reservations be split up into individual parcels and sold to individual families as a way to encourage American Indians to adopt Western ways of doing things, of living. Now, there were, of course, some limitations on the progress. We do see this representing the most radical shift in Indian policy for the United States in our nation's history, but the living conditions on reservations did not really significantly improve, even with all of these new practices in place. For Mexican Americans, the meager opportunities for work and the general decline for labor meant that more than 400,000 were forced to return to Mexico. The mass departures for Mexico were both voluntary and forced. A majority of those encouraged to leave were recent immigrants, but they also included something around 200,000 children who were born in the United States and therefore American citizens, and so being forced to leave the country of their birth. The situation among California farm workers was grim. Those that were remaining often worked in these fruit and vegetable fields in California under the grimmest of conditions. They were also widely excluded from the Social Security and Wagner Acts, which did not apply to agricultural workers, and generally faced a stringent suppression of unionization efforts among workers as well. African Americans also faced some unique hardships. They were often considered the last hired and first fired, and so hit hardest by the Depression. Even those that managed to keep their jobs faced competition from unemployed white workers. Now, generally speaking, Black Americans were excluded from many of the key entitlements of the welfare state. The Southern Democratic hold on Congress played a huge part in this as well. The Solid South helped to mold the New Deal into an entitlement for whites. And it was at the insistence of Southern Democrats that programs like Social Security excluded agricultural and domestic workers, which were the largest categories for employment among Black Americans. This ultimately confined them to the public assistance portion of the Social Security Act, which was the least generous and most vulnerable wing of the new welfare state. It was, in fact, open to all Americans who could demonstrate a need, but the benefits were often very low, and the standards included moral behavior standards, which were often defined by local authorities, and the vagueness gave those authorities the leverage to discriminate against certain applicants, particularly racial minorities. The recipients also came to bear the stigma of dependency on government handouts. With an unemployment rate, however, that doubled what the employment rate for white Americans was Black Americans benefited disproportionately from direct relief programs. However, they were largely excluded from others, like I mentioned, Social Security and the Wagner Act in particular. We see instead a growing focus among Black Americans on economic survival instead. Now, the New Deal does get a kind of egalitarian current running through it. While Roosevelt himself seemed to have very little personal interest in race relations, he did appoint Mary McLeod Bethune, who was a prominent Black educator, as a special advisor on minority affairs. And key members of his administration were also keenly concerned on the issue of race relations. His wife, however, was a particular advocate, drawing national attention to the injustices of segregation, disenfranchisement, and lynching. We also are going to see, for the first time since the passage of the 15th Amendment, a shift of Black voters from the Republican Party, the party of Lincoln, in favor of the New Deal Democratic Party. However, the New Deal will also serve to preserve and reinforce the racial order of the day, particularly with the limitations of things like the Social Security Act, but also the failure of Congress to pass an anti-lynching law and the failure of FDR to actually support the passage of the law as well. So there are going to be some significant limitations to the relief measures for the New Deal. Now, it is important to remember that the New Deal itself is not actually going to end the Depression. The thing that will ultimately pull the United States out of the Depression will be the Second World War. The Second World War is going to create huge demand for American goods and be the thing that largely puts most Americans back to work and gets our economy back and booming again. And that's where we will be headed in our next unit, is the Second World War.